Good morning to our attendees, and we want to say thank you very much for taking the time out this Tuesday morning. Obviously, our first slide is always tips to continually prevent COVID-19. This protocol is going to pretty much be on all of our Toolbox Talks, purely because COVID has not left us yet, but it is not just for COVID. We've mentioned this before. Health and safety in the workplace comes down to hygiene, good hygiene practices as well. So washing your hands regularly with soap and water. If this is not available, using an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. Adhering to social distancing measures when people are sick. And then covering your cough and sneeze with a flexed elbow or tissue. And then throwing that tissue into the bin. And cleaning and disinfecting frequently touched objects and surfaces. And if you are able to, do your part and get vaccinated. So these tips obviously to always help us keep good hygiene within the workplace. Now we come to our last Toolbox Talk for September. We've mentioned this before. Our safety thought 0 is no accident for the whole of this month, purely because September is that initiative to drive home the pure fact that it is possible to achieve 0 accidents within an industry. So September, as it was every single year in September, FEM hosts its September initiative to educate the construction industry on the most common accidents that lead to fatalities and ways to make a workplace safe. Now, we remember that we have spoken about September throughout all our Toolbox Talks this past month, and we realize that accidents on the road, especially in vehicles, are the highest cause of fatalities within the construction industry, as well as working at heights, particularly working from roofs, ladders, scaffold, and then mobile elevated working platforms. So as a plumber, as well as IOPS's initiative to always bring to you the most informative material and to keep you safe when you are out there, we urge you to please take on the 0 is no accident safety slogan. And that is to protect yourself as well as your team that you are working with. We do appreciate every single one of you out there, and we do really hope that you take on the 0 is no accident slogan as part of your company's health and safety policies. So it is important that we firmly believe that every accident is preventable, and that in industry, and for us in plumbing, 0 accidents is achievable. So let us see if we can continue to do that, not just through September, but throughout the rest of the year as well. Now, when we spoke about environmental risks and hazards, we mentioned that it's not specifically speaking about trees and bees or the nature around us. We are looking specifically at the environmental regulations for workplaces of 1987. And these regulations deal with a few things like thermal requirements. So if you are working in environments that are very cold, or if you are working in environments that are very hot, there are certain requirements that must be adhered to. So for those who perhaps work in cold rooms, cold storage rooms, plants where they have to be inside or near ovens at any given time, then thermal requirements in terms of environmental regulations will affect them. Now, for you as a plumber, you might think, well, we don't deal with heavy thermal requirements, but lighting surely affects each and every single company out there. And this is whether you're in an office or whether you're out on site. Good lighting is very important to ensure, first of all, that you can see the hazards and risks around you and that you can see the task at hand. That is to make sure that you can actually see the tools, the inspections, making sure that you can actually perform the installation correctly so that you have good quality, and at the same time, you have a speed of work that you would normally not have if you didn't have good lighting. It also covers things like windows, ventilation, housekeeping, noise and hearing conservation, precautions against flooding, as well as fire precaution and means of egress. So when we talk about a she-rep, and many of you might know what a she-rep is, that's as soon as you have 1 to 20 employees, you have to appoint as well as nominate and elect a health and safety representative. They often call them she-reps, and many get confused with the term she-rep and a shirk or SHEC representative. Those are two completely different areas. So when we talk about a she-rep in terms of Section 17 of the OUSH Act, we are including safety, health, as well as this environmental regulations. So the environmental regulations here that we are referring to are the workplace environment. Things like, is there adequate lighting for staff to work? Are the windows clean and allow good light through the windows? Do they allow for both manual ventilation? And then do you have ventilation that is a mechanical means of ventilation? What about good housekeeping practices? Making sure noise is kept to a minimum so that you can conserve hearing. Any precautions against flooding within a building. And then finally, precautions for fire. This would include things like firefighting techniques or being trained as a firefighter, as well as how to get in and out of a building in an emergency situation. So that's where a health and safety rep, or SHE rep, as the term comes in, will assist a company. Now, when we think of somebody that is a SHIRK representative or a SHIC representative, we're talking about somebody that has gone through safety, health, environment, including natural environment and quality, or risk and quality. And those work more on your ISO standards. So if you want more information on that or the difference between those, please get in touch and we'll send you a mail just explaining what those are as well. All right, so let's take a look at what environmental hazards for you as plumbers out there might face. And the three that we want to take from the regulations is looking at housekeeping, noise, and fire. So obviously the others still affect you, things like ventilation, things like light, and perhaps even thermal requirements for some of you who are working in that environment. But we want to just focus on these three aspects. So let's take a look at these three items and identify where a plumber fits into those risks and hazards. And then what can be done to prevent incidents and accidents. Again, moving forward with that zero is no accident slogan for this month. The first one is housekeeping. Now, poor housekeeping leads to multiple risks: slipping and tripping hazards, poor quality installations due to incorrect tools or incorrect equipment being used. Disorganization as a whole leads to, first of all, rushing the job, because if we haven't allocated enough time, or if we have allocated enough time, but we are just disorganized in our work, it will take so long in order to get organized that we don't leave enough time to do the job. Most common is that we don't leave enough time to do our safety either. You see, normally what happens is when the job is being pushed, in other words, there's a time frame on a job to be done. Either you're being pushed because of time during the day, the amount of time allocated, or perhaps you're being pushed because of delays on a site or delays on a project, or just the client wants this installation done as soon as possible because it's an emergency job. Then you start rushing the work automatically. Now, if you are disorganized, that is going to rush even more, because you are going to waste time looking for the right tools, looking for the right equipment, perhaps even using the wrong tool or the wrong equipment purely because you don't have the time to look for it. But now what always gets left to last? You see, because doing the job is your main area of concern. Having the right tools and making sure you look after your client is probably your second area of concern. That means safety is going to come after that, which means if housekeeping is not done correctly, when things are not clean or tidy, you will be distracted. And this can lead to causing incidents or accidents, or walking right into an incident or an accident, which means safety then is almost non-existent on a site, purely because we are distracted by poor housekeeping. Now you think to yourself, what is the opposite then? If we have poor housekeeping, which leads to multiple risks, then would good housekeeping lead to a eradication of those risks and hazards? Well, let us take a look at some of the benefits of housekeeping. Remember the slogan for housekeeping: a place for everything and everything in its place. And that's generally what we want to do on a site. If we take a tool from somewhere, then that tool should go back into the same place. Now, many plumbers, and I have seen this, sometimes I get to your site and I look at your toolbox, and some of them is just a whole bunch of tools put into the toolbox, but everybody knows where it is inside that toolbox because the tool goes into the toolbox. Then I've been onto some sites where the plumber has cut out foam and each tool goes into a specific section into the foam, and that looks absolutely amazing. So whatever you do to keep your housekeeping tidy, to make sure that it looks good and that you know exactly where your tools are. And I have heard it before where some plumbers have said, well, all my tools are in the back of the bucket and I know where everything is. It's organized chaos. Please don't use that term, organized chaos. Rather get organized. Don't include the chaos side of it, because organization will keep you undistracted from what is the task at hand, as well as ensuring that you have sufficient amounts of time to do your toolbox talks, DSTRs, your risk assessments, or just doing a good, quick site inspection to make sure that it is safe for you to work at. So let's look at the benefits. Time is saved by not having to search for things, search for the right tool, search for the right equipment. And then if we don't find it, or perhaps we left it at the office because we weren't organized in the morning, we use the incorrect tool. Injuries are prevented because passages and workplaces are free from obstructions caused by materials, caused by tools or equipment laying around. You see, housekeeping goes further than just, making sure that the area around us is clean, but even passages and workplaces. Now, if you put a whole lot of tools, if you put equipment or even materials in the way of somebody walking, a walking path, or even an emergency path, you can just see how fatal that could become in an emergency situation. Then you will notice this. Normally, once you tidy up a room, tidy up that drawer that you have at your house that's full of electric cables, you have a lot of space left. Once it's clean, it includes the availability of additional space. So space is saved if articles are neatly packed and correctly stored. And it just feels better. There's nobody here on this Toolbox Talk that can't say after they've cleaned up or tidied up, it doesn't feel better. After a good night of maybe having your braai on Heritage Day, you perhaps had a bit of a dirty kitchen. And then once it was cleaned up and you woke up in the morning to a clean kitchen, or you cleaned it the next morning, however you did it, you actually felt better afterwards. So not just space, but the good feeling that comes with housekeeping is definitely a benefit. Now, there's another one that's very important, and it leads to what we're going to discuss a little bit later in fire risk as well, because the risk of a fire is diminished when provision is made for the correct placing of the right type of refuse bins, storage areas which comply with good storage practices, as well as stacking is done in accordance with accepted stacking practices. So if we do ensure that we have the correct type of bin, we have the correct type of storage areas, we are not going to cross-contaminate and potentially put two things that shouldn't be placed together, like some of our paint thinners, some of our silicons, sometimes even the type of PVC welding that we have cannot be placed with other types of materials that could become flammable. Housekeeping essentially is then going to eliminate the risk for a potential fire breaking out as well. So overall, a site is safer with good housekeeping practices, as well as good hygiene and health due to good routine of good housekeeping. So we cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have good housekeeping practices on a site. Now, the next thing we wanted to discuss was noise. So the environmental regulation speaks about noise and hearing conservation. A noise zone means an area where the equivalent noise is equal to or excess of 85 decibels. This is measured in accordance with your SANS 83. So 85 decibels is not very loud. If you had to measure what 85 decibels is, that is like normal ambient room, not quiet room, but a normal busy room, if I could put it that way. That is generally about 85 decibels. Now, anything above that becomes a noise zone. So when we start using grinders, when we start drilling into walls and use the hammer action of the drill, when we start using generators on site, all of these areas around that task will be considered a noise zone, because this will now start going towards the 85 or exceeding the 85 decibel mark. So repeated exposure to these loud noises can lead to permanent tinnitus. Now, tinnitus is that permanent ringing in your ear, or hearing loss eventually over time. Now, this is something that most youngsters don't understand. You see, they'll be in a vehicle coming to work with loud subwoofers, and yes, it sounds good and it's nice when you're younger. And as you get older, you start realizing the effect or the damage that this is starting to have. And only later in life do we realize how dangerous it was when we were doing those things. Now, no, we're not trying to preach to you or say to you that you shouldn't be going to clubs or listening to loud music. This 100% all rests with you. But in the workplace, when it comes to occupational health and safety, we are just asking you to ensure that you protect your hearing from the noise-related risks on site. So loud noises can create physical and psychological stress. It will reduce productivity. It will interfere with communication and concentration, and it can contribute to workplace accidents and injuries by making it difficult to hear warning signals. Now, oftentimes what is happening on site, and you'll notice this, if you walk into a construction site, you are not allowed to wear any earphones or any Apple iPods or anything like that, AirPods. That is purely because you need to be aware of your surrounding. But if you're working in a noise zone, then you have to wear the appropriate ear protection in order to protect yourself from that specific noise. Now, you're not going to realize the benefits tomorrow or the next day or even in the next week. By protecting your hearing, it is going to take a long time before you realize the actual benefits. And that is when you're 50, 60, 70, 80 years old and you can still hear. Whereas if we don't adhere to the noise risks or noise zone areas, and we continue to subject ourselves to repeated exposures to loud noise, and not wearing the correct type of PPE or not protecting ourselves correctly from these noisy environments, then later on in life, we will then face these consequences. So you can stop that from happening later on. And this is something that often happens within the construction industry or because of the types of tools that we are using. Now, the first thing we must do, because before you resort to that PPE, that was the first thing we mentioned, right? You want to put ear muffs on or earplugs on. But the first thing you need to do is to look at an assessment of the noise area. Try and identify where is the point of the noise hazard. What is creating the noise hazard? And can you determine if there are more appropriate levels of protection first? You see, sometimes you can barricade the area, and let us explain to you what we mean by this. Maybe the person using the drill has no other option but to wear the correct type of PPE. But the people in the environment are also exposed to that noise. So you can ask yourself, do those people have to be in that environment while that work is taking place? Well, if it's not necessary and only one person has to be there as a supervisor, well, then that person then can wear the PPE while the rest can be removed. So you're removing them from the hazard, which means you are eliminating the hazard for them. And you're only exposing 2 people to the hazard, but protecting them with the correct type of PPE. Well, now you say, well, we can't remove the people from that area. Well, can you put a noise barrier around the person doing the grinding? You see, you do get them. There's little sheets, sometimes boards that you can place up while the grinding is in place, and that will basically dim out some of the noise. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. And then take a reading on the outside of that wall, and you'll notice that it is a lot less than being inside of that noise zone. And perhaps not as much type of PPE will be required. So that brings us then obviously to always putting in PPE. It is a mandatory requirement, but it is the last point of protection. But now that you've done everything to prevent a noisy environment, the next step is not just to wear PPE, but to research the correct type of PPE. You see, what type of hearing protection do you actually need? Do you just need normal earplugs? Do you need earmuffs? And then what rating must your earmuffs be at? You see, it determines the noise that you will be exposed to the level of protection of that noise that you will need. So it's not just having PPE, but it's having the right or correct type of PPE. So if you don't know, rather ask. Get a PPE consultant to assist you in your assessments to make sure that you have the right PPE for the individual using it, as well as for the tasks that you are going to find. Now, fire risk. Fire risk includes also hot works risks. So plumbers, you need to solder, you need to weld, you need to grind, you need to use hazardous chemical substances, and these all create a potential fire risk on site. This could cause burns, serious injuries, smoke inhalation, or even a major fire, which could lead to serious losses. So a fire risk on site, or fire where it comes to a plumber, is a high potential. Fire exits and emergency evacuations are also included in fire risks. You see, because if you obstruct a fire exit, it is just as bad, and this could lead to being stuck inside a building, burning building, or obstructing emergency services from gaining access to the building to perform a rescue, or even perform firefighting techniques to put out a fire. Now, we have had it in many cases. Just in this past few months, we've been doing a lot of sprinkler systems with some of our clients, and the plumbers have been called out to change some areas for sprinkler systems, to test the sprinkler systems as well. And then some have even had to divert sprinkler systems because of building that has happened in the company, and additions or retractions from the actual building. And so the fire sprinklers had to be off for a certain period of time. Now, in the risk management world or safety management world, this is a huge risk. Can you imagine for the whole time that plumber is working on that fire sprinkler, it being off? We have no protection against fire in the entire building. And so that is a huge fire risk. Even though there is no fire currently, if there was one, you'd have to be on high alert in order to use the fire extinguishers rather, because the sprinklers are going to be offline. So a lot of pressure is obviously on the plumber in order to get the job done as quickly as possible, in order to get the risk of not having extinguishers, or rather sprinklers, up and running, compared to the risk of the plumber that has to work on a fire sprinkler system, because there's no huge risk of fire while working on the actual sprinkler system. So we have to always gauge as to what is the best method for performing the work. You see, having fire extinguishers readily available at each point, making sure that the firefighters of the company were readily available at their desks with two-way radios, making sure that additional fire extinguishers were brought to site, all of that, try to eliminate the fire risk as much as possible. But we could only reduce that risk. We could not eliminate it altogether. And this is often what's going to happen with a plumber. You might be able to minimize the risk, but you might not be able to get rid of it altogether. But there are things you can do that will benefit you to have good fire safety. And these are things that perhaps you only use because your client wants you to use it, and is not something that you have within your company. For hot works, generally you should have a permit in place. And we're not talking about on a construction site where the safety officer says you have to have a hot works permit. We are saying an in-house permitting system to ensure that a permit is received or requested for any hot works. Now, what that permit actually does is it helps you to ensure that all risks are covered, and then control measures are in place. It's like a mini DSTI for hot works. So if you think of a daily safe task instruction, you can use that exact same template and design it into a permit. Or we've got permits readily available. We have them. If you want that template, we will send it through to you. Maybe incorporate this into your in-house safety system, because it helps you to track what is needed for the specific scope of the fire risk. And then it gives you an opportunity, first of all, to provide training on fire precautions to employees, and then have somebody to take responsibility for that job that's being done. Now, having that responsibility, somebody signing off a permit, and signing acceptance of a permit helps them to understand the need for health and safety. You see, it enforces the health and safety rules in a manner that is not dictative, but rather supportive of what your current policies are. And this all leads to helping you with emergency management. Having an obstruction-free emergency access and egress is one thing, but do you know who to call in an emergency? So let's say you've got your emergency numbers posted everywhere. Is that updated? Is it specific to the area that you are working in? Perhaps are a plumber situated out in the Tshwane area, Pretoria, and you know all the local hospitals, but you're being called out to now go and work in Midrand. Do you know who the emergency services are in Midrand that you would need to call? Perhaps you're down in Cape Town, in city center, but now you need to start venturing out. You're going around to the Bloberg Strand side, and you're not in city center anymore. For them to get from city center just to Bloberg, which is not far for you to drive, is going to take a long time for emergency services to get there. So ask yourself, when it comes to fire safety, have you got all of your areas covered? Not just from the individual doing the work, protecting themselves and preventing fires, but if emergencies do happen, who do you call? How are you going to call them? And are those numbers updated? So that's all for us this morning. We thank you very much for joining us on our Toolbox Talks every Tuesday morning. And for all of our members out there, we really appreciate that you take the time out on a Tuesday morning, as well as everybody else that joins in. If you want to get in touch with us, please use the safety@iopsa.org email, the info@ohss.co.za, or WhatsApp me on 071 875 2070. Now, coming up for the month of October, we are looking at inclement weather coming up now because of our rainy season, as well as the heat that we are going to be facing even now, currently, the hot heat that we are currently facing. And then we'll end off with Legionella, as well as hand tool cleanliness. But as always, our safety thought for September is zero is no accident. Just a very big thank you once again to all of our attendees, as well as our OPSA members. And we hope you have a safe time and an undistracted time with load shedding currently happening. I do realize load shedding is a huge issue for many of us, not being able to use tools or creating additional hazards because we're trying to circumvent load shedding. We realize that you are doing everything in your power to prevent these incidents and accidents, and we thank you for doing that. Thanks.